Right now, I have up on my desktop something that is available on what appears to be a foreign website, not from the United States. It appears to be located in Europe. It is a agenda concerning the proceedings of a conference that happened in the Permian Basin on March 8th through 9th of 1990. Conference was located in Midland, Texas. In 2020, on the anniversary of this conference, I contacted who was at that time identified via the Permian Basin Conference organizing entity. It was responsible for the conference that was upcoming for the year 2020. I contacted who was identified as the legal counsel. I told them that I had had experiences in connection with this specific conference and that I was contacting them in anticipation of the anniversary. 2000, 2010, 2020. That's 30 years. I found this specific document exactly 30 years before the comparable conference. Why? The Slaughter Estate Unit. Outcrop subsurface comparisons of heterogeneity. Cased hole hydrocarbon detection. Price perceptions. But there's one in here that's of specific concern. Because in situ stress evaluation. But there's another one. In this agenda are what I believe to be references that were allowed to be programmed with a visual representation of the specific techniques that were discussed. And when they were allowed to be programmed in connection with this specific conference, they were used in underwriting on some sort of security instrument that was taken out in anticipation of what was to occur in connection with the first Gulf War. I was a young child at the time, aboard a military base that provided very important logistics in connection with the events of the first Gulf War, including leading up to the invasion of Kuwait. I was very young. I was, I believe, in 5th or 6th grade. This was the only time in my childhood that I remember I attended a public school, and it just so happened the public school system in the county outside of the military installation I lived on engaged in very significant public bond issue at that time. I didn't know these things. My parents, I honestly believe, didn't know these things, but somebody did. Events in the lives of me and a number of people around my age significantly changed at that time. Among the many things that happened were biophysiological changes. Me and a number of other people started developing very, very bad facial acne. You can say acne, it just happens to people. But my hair started changing color. I used to have very, very, very blonde hair. But then my hair got darker almost immediately. My eyebrows became very thick. I had a monobrow that grew in a very quick time frame. These biophysiological changes were happening to me in the period leading up to what turned out to be the invasion of Iraq. I started having dreams or visualizations. When you're a child, you don't really understand the implications. Things that otherwise didn't seem appropriate for 4th, 5th, 6th, maybe even 7th graders started to happen, especially as our parents had been deployed abroad and other parents were working, including during time frames when we would have been the equivalent of what they called at the time latchkey kids. There was a lot of precocity for young people our age that didn't make sense. We didn't act that way. It wasn't a part of our culture. Those weren't the kinds of things we did, but then all of a sudden, it just started happening. We were inspired to do these things that didn't make sense. Have parties, play strip poker, look at pornography, watch movies that had satanic themes, horror movies. Kids like horror movies. But this isn't who we were before this time frame occurred. I honestly believe they used this specific conference, that companies that were at this conference and that are on this agenda strategically and specifically engaged in a paradigm where they began a particular stage of what was an unrolling biological weapons paradigm, and they were using children on that base at that time, perhaps among others, as a specific round of human test subject experimentation. Specifically, there were a number of us that were not going to school on base because there was a school on base for our age range, but we had been identified as gifted. And because we were gifted, we had to go to the advanced placement and gifted classes that were held at the public school off base. During this time frame, in a biology class I had as part of this gifted program, we were required to do a term paper on a communicable disease. I did mine on malaria. I got an A+. I drew a picture. If you look at my Facebook account, you're going to see a graphic in the background. That graphic in the background is comparable to the illustration I made for the cover of that paper. I believe they've been using that paper in some sort of hedging strategy, as well as projects I did as part of being in gifted classes. We had to do historical projects. We had to do science projects. Somebody took what I did, at least, for my science project and my historical projects, and they made options. And they put them in somebody else's political hedging strategy because they've been coming up and recirculating over and over again ever since, sometime with greater or lesser specificity. Now, I gotta be honest with you. I don't know if they do this for every group of school children all over the country, and if they've been doing this since the 80s and into the 90s. I don't know. It's unacceptable. I have been trafficked for 30 years in connection with deals directly associated with the companies listed right here. A lot of them are still around. A lot of them have members on their boards of directors now that have all kinds of other derivative processes that are supposed to replace my actual life and work. I believe they were strategically coordinated and strategically engaged. And I was supposed to be diverted into another element where I was operating with the abstract and the derivative aspects, using the other side of my brain, more visual, maybe more artistic. So these literal processes that are discussed here that have actual engineering implications can be allowed to manifest as some form of visualization that is coded into the underwriting of somebody's financial portfolio. Now, I know that there are those, including those who were formerly in the military, who are engaged either in the private sector or as a private contractor in connection with companies that are listed right here, as well as later subsidiaries of these companies. But these companies did not have a right to usurp the Constitution and code the horrendous implications of what they're trying to socially engineer here in order to create leverage to extort their way into what they're trying to socially and otherwise engineer abroad. The same companies. This is unacceptable. There are a number of currently pending municipal bonds right now that fit this exact same kind of conspiratorial structure, directly attributable to moments in my life and the lives of people I've known. Several of them are in Texas. Several of them are in Texas, and by the way, are being issued now after at least 3 years worth of attempts to issue bonds in those same areas. Bonds that were interfered with in accordance with the things that were ongoing with COVID-19. And now they're trying to reissue new bonds, including for the same entities? I don't think so. It's been far too long. Not only that, but while the explicit references to these bonds, including the dates, fit a very specific strategic timeline, what they also do is involve, if one understands and opens up the specific matrix associated with the organization representing them in the manner it is, which I also understand is responsible for, among other things, managing the pension system here in the city of Dallas, as well as the pension systems for numerous other investment funds that finance both public and private pension systems, that what you see is references to appropriations bills from the past, including appropriations bills that for the last year and a half have been intentionally overwritten. That the actual information available on the official congressional websites associated with past appropriations bills as of last summer had been recapitulated to defraud us by intentionally misrepresenting what was in the appropriations bills at the time. Not so ironically, it involves one of the specific municipal bonds that is for here in Texas that not only is connected to intentional misrepresentation of an overwrite of a past appropriations bill, at least insofar as it's available through the official electronic record associated with Congress, but also has incredibly anti-Semitic implications and is part of an ongoing process of using a completely racialized and persecutorial schematology. Now, does this specific element have to do directly with the war in Iraq and the results of the invasion of Iraq from 2002? Well, you have to go back to 1992. You're going to have to go back to 1990. You've been flipped. Those bonds have been allowed to get flipped for over 30 years now. There's no plausible deniability. It's absolutely 100% connected. And not only is it 100% connected, but I contend the information in here is also connected to information about how concurrently cases were pending in the areas referenced here, specifically in Texas and Oklahoma. And somebody used those cases as part of the underwriting at the time and have been using that in connection with their speculation ever since. Now, I don't know what everybody else at this conference was doing in 1990, but around the time this conference was pending, Kenneth Starr and Robert Mueller were not in the positions they were later identified with and known for. But what they were doing at the time is directly connected to what was going on here and what was impacting the actual hormonal development of minors aboard a military installation within the United States that was in a process of preparing logistically to engage in what was identified at the time as being a necessary military action abroad. Was it a military action? Or were we supposed to be some sort of confidential class of test subjects in what was already known to be incredibly illegal and unconstitutional? See, they didn't just leave it with the military population. The decommissioning of the military way of life, including the base establishment and including long-term dependent benefits, has now put us into the situation we're in. There's no justification anymore for trying to say that because your father or your grandfather was in the military, you're the one that owes the social cost. When you, as a purported leader in whatever relationship you have, has allowed for this to continue to roll out. Unfortunately, somebody is really going to seriously have to reevaluate whatever else was going on in connection with every single municipal bond that is listed in this particular tranche. What happened this weekend was absolutely mercenary. It cannot be allowed to persist. And I apologize to whoever it was that was supposed to be the legal representative for the Permian Basin Conference from 2020, but I watched all year what they did. They haven't learned anything in 30 years about how to be responsible for what it was they thought they were entitled to get away with then. Having Congress try to do some committee meeting where they recalibrate the metrics in order to offset losses that they've been trying to cover up is not going to cut it. Let this be an official notice. It's 4 minutes before noon in Dallas, Texas. That means it's 4 minutes before 1 o'clock in Washington, D.C. I'm really hoping you're nowhere near the Capitol ground right now.